In the labyrinth of human relationships, we often find ourselves drawn to people who ultimately drain our energy, manipulate our emotions, and leave us questioning our own sanity. These encounters are not merely unfortunate coincidences, but patterns deeply rooted in our unconscious mind. Patterns that the renowned Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Carl Gustav Jung illuminated through his groundbreaking work on personality archetypes and shadow integration. What if I told you that Jung's analytical psychology could help you identify potentially dangerous individuals before they cause significant damage to your psyche? What if there was a way to recognize the subtle warning signs that your unconscious mind perceives long before your conscious awareness catches up? The human psyche, according to Jung's profound observations, is an intricate universe of conscious and unconscious elements constantly engaging in a complex dance. Within this dance, we encounter various archetypal figures, both within ourselves and projected onto others, that shape our interactions and relationships. Some of these encounters can be deeply transformative in positive ways, while others can lead us down paths of psychological destruction so subtle we barely notice until we're completely lost. Have you ever found yourself repeatedly drawn to people who seem charming and magnetic at first, only to discover later that beneath that captivating exterior lies something far more insidious? This pattern is not random. It speaks to deeper psychological mechanisms that Jung meticulously mapped throughout his lifetime of research. Today, we're diving deep into a subject that Carl Gustav Jung approached with both clinical precision and philosophical depth: the dangerous personality types that can wreak havoc on your psychological well-being. These are not simply difficult people. They are individuals whose psychological makeup creates a perfect storm that can dismantle your sense of self, distort your reality, and ultimately lead to profound suffering. Understanding these types through a Jungian lens offers not just protection but profound insight into the darker aspects of human nature that we all must learn to navigate. By the end of this exploration, you'll possess the psychological tools to identify these dangerous personalities with remarkable clarity. What makes this knowledge so crucial is that these dangerous types often don't appear dangerous at all, at least not initially. In fact, many present themselves as quite the opposite: charismatic, charming, even healing presences in your life. This is precisely what makes them so perilous. The unconscious attraction we feel toward them is often rooted in our own unresolved complexes and psychological wounds, what Jung would call our shadow material seeking recognition and integration through projection. These dangerous types become mirrors reflecting parts of ourselves we haven't yet acknowledged or healed, creating a powerful unconscious hook that can keep us trapped in destructive relationships far longer than reason would dictate. Consider for a moment: how many relationships in your life have left you feeling inexplicably drained, confused, or diminished? How many times have you found yourself saying, "I should have seen the warning signs"? The truth is that your unconscious mind likely did perceive these warnings, but without the proper psychological framework to interpret them, these crucial signals remained in the shadow of your awareness. Today, that changes. By understanding the 6 dangerous personality types through the lens of Jungian psychology, you'll develop a psychological radar system that detects threats to your well-being long before they manifest as crises. This knowledge isn't about fostering paranoia. It's about developing psychological discernment that leads to healthier, more fulfilling connections with others. The first dangerous person Carl Gustav Jung would warn us about is the persona manipulator. This individual has mastered the art of wearing social masks to such a degree that they've lost touch with their authentic self entirely. Jung spoke extensively about the persona, our social face or mask that we present to the world, as a necessary psychological function. However, he was deeply concerned about those who become so identified with their personas that they essentially become hollow vessels, shape-shifting to gain advantage in any situation without any core identity to anchor them. These individuals are dangerous precisely because they can become whatever you need them to be in the moment, mirroring your desires and values so perfectly that you feel an immediate and profound connection. The persona manipulator operates by carefully studying their targets, identifying psychological vulnerabilities, and then crafting a persona specifically designed to exploit those vulnerabilities. What makes them particularly dangerous is their uncanny ability to detect your unmet needs and unfulfilled desires, perhaps needs for validation, understanding, or belonging that stem from early wounded experiences. They then position themselves as the perfect solution to those unmet needs, creating a powerful hook in your psyche. The connection feels magical, even destined, because they've engineered it to resonate with your deepest psychological patterns. You may find yourself thinking, "Finally, someone who truly understands me," unaware that this understanding is being used as the foundation for future manipulation. According to Jungian psychology, we are particularly vulnerable to persona manipulators during periods of psychological transition or crisis, times when our own identity feels fluid or uncertain. During these periods, our psychological boundaries become more permeable, and we naturally seek external anchors to stabilize our sense of self. The persona manipulator intuitively recognizes this vulnerability and positions themselves as that perfect anchor. The danger intensifies because these relationships often begin with a period of idealization that Jung would recognize as an archetypal projection. We see in them not who they actually are, but an idealized image that represents our own psychological needs. This creates a powerful bond that becomes increasingly difficult to break, even as their true nature starts to reveal itself. What makes identification of the persona manipulator so challenging is that they themselves often believe in whatever persona they're currently embodying. Unlike simple liars who consciously deceive, many persona manipulators have become so dissociated from their authentic self that they temporarily become their masks, giving their performances a conviction that can fool even the most psychologically astute observers. Jung would understand this as a severe form of self-alienation. These individuals have suppressed their true nature so deeply that they access it only in fleeting moments, usually when they're alone or when their manipulations fail, triggering narcissistic rage. This transient authenticity makes them all the more convincing and therefore all the more dangerous to those caught in their psychological web. The shadow side of our attraction to persona manipulators lies in our own discomfort with psychological wholeness. Jung emphasized that true psychological health requires embracing both our light and shadow aspects, the parts of ourselves we readily identify with and the parts we reject or deny. The persona manipulator offers a seductive alternative. They present a reality where only the pleasing, acceptable parts need exist. They mirror back to us only what we wish to see, creating an artificial environment where shadow integration seems unnecessary. This feels like relief, like finding a haven from the difficult work of facing our own contradictions and complexities. Yet this relief is temporary and illusory, ultimately leaving us more psychologically fragmented than before the encounter, which is precisely why Carl Gustav Jung would urge us to recognize and avoid these dangerous individuals before they destabilize our path toward wholeness. The second dangerous personality type that emerges from Carl Gustav Jung's psychological framework is the shadow projector. This individual lives in a state of profound self-deception, unable or unwilling to recognize the darker aspects of their own psyche. Instead, they compulsively project these disowned qualities onto others, creating a distorted worldview where they are perpetually virtuous while everyone else embodies the negative qualities they cannot acknowledge in themselves. Jung considered the shadow, those aspects of our personality that we refuse to recognize or accept, to be a critical component of psychological wholeness. When someone pathologically projects their shadow material, they become dangerous not just to themselves but to everyone around them, as they create elaborate justifications for treating others poorly based on qualities that actually reside within themselves. The shadow projector moves through the world in a state of perpetual accusation. If they are secretly harboring jealousy, they will accuse you of being envious of them. If they feel impulses toward infidelity, they will become obsessively suspicious of your loyalty. If they harbor prejudice, they will see bigotry in your most innocent remarks. This relentless projection creates an environment of psychological gaslighting, where you constantly find yourself defending against accusations that actually reveal the shadow projector's own inner landscape. The particular danger of this personality type lies in how they can make you doubt your own perceptions and intentions. Over time, their projections can become so persistent and convincing that you begin to wonder if perhaps they're seeing something about you that you've failed to recognize yourself. Jung observed that shadow projection intensifies in proportion to the individual's resistance to self-knowledge. The more vehemently someone denies their shadow aspects, the more violently these disowned qualities must be projected outward. This creates a dangerous escalation pattern in relationships with shadow projectors. As tensions rise, their projections become increasingly extreme and accusatory. What might begin as subtle insinuations about your motives evolves into outright accusations of malevolence. This escalation serves a psychological purpose for them. The more thoroughly they can convince themselves that the darkness resides in you rather than in them, the more completely they can avoid the painful work of shadow integration that Jung considered essential to psychological maturity. What makes the shadow projector particularly difficult to disengage from is the way they create elaborate communal reinforcement for their projections. They don't simply accuse you privately. They build coalitions, sharing their distorted perceptions with others in ways that can damage your reputation and isolate you socially. Jung understood the power of collective psychology and how easily individual perceptions can become reinforced through group dynamics. The shadow projector intuitively leverages this psychological principle, creating situations where multiple people might begin to view you through the lens of their projections. This social dimension adds a layer of reality to their distortions that can make you question yourself even more deeply, wondering if perhaps so many people see something negative in you. Could it actually be true? The psychological damage inflicted by prolonged exposure to a shadow projector can be profound and enduring. Beyond the immediate distress of being chronically mischaracterized, there's a deeper wound that forms, what Jung might describe as a violation of your psychological integrity. When someone persistently projects their disowned qualities onto you with enough conviction, these projections can begin to penetrate your psychological boundaries, planting seeds of self-doubt that may continue to grow long after the relationship has ended. Jung would emphasize that protecting yourself from shadow projectors isn't simply a matter of personal comfort, but of preserving the integrity of your individuation process, your journey toward becoming your authentic self. Recognizing and disengaging from these individuals becomes an act of psychological self-preservation. The third dangerous personality type, illuminated by Jungian psychology, is the animus possessor. These individuals have become completely identified with their inner opposite-gender archetypal energy, men possessed by their anima, inner feminine, or women possessed by their animus, inner masculine, losing all balance and perspective in the process. For Jung, the anima and animus represented essential components of the psyche that require integration for psychological wholeness. However, when someone becomes possessed by these archetypal energies rather than integrating them, they project powerful unconscious material onto others with an intensity that can create destructive relationship dynamics. These individuals often manifest an uncanny ability to hook into your deepest romantic or sexual complexes, creating relationships characterized by obsession rather than genuine intimacy. The danger of the animus/animus possessor lies in how they activate archetypal patterns within your own psyche. Jung recognized that these primordial images of masculine and feminine carry tremendous psychological energy that can overwhelm conscious reasoning when activated. When you encounter someone possessed by these energies, they can trigger a complementary possession in you, creating a relationship dynamic that feels fated or cosmically significant despite being psychologically imbalanced. You may feel drawn to them with an intensity that defies logical explanation, as if you've known them across multiple lifetimes. This sensation isn't entirely delusional. You are indeed recognizing something profound, but it's a recognition of archetypal patterns rather than authentic connection. The relationship becomes a vessel for unconscious projection rather than genuine relating. The relationship with an animus/animus possessor typically unfolds in distinct phases that Jung might recognize as archetypal in nature. The initial phase often involves idealization, so extreme it borders on deification. You don't simply love this person. You worship them as the embodiment of all your unconscious ideals about the opposite gender. This phase feels transcendent but contains the seeds of inevitable disappointment, as no human can sustainably embody a pure archetype. When reality inevitably asserts itself, revealing the human beneath the projection, the relationship typically transitions to a devaluation phase equally extreme as the idealization that preceded it. The resulting emotional whiplash can create profound psychological disorientation and trauma, as the very qualities that inspired devotion become sources of disillusionment and betrayal. What makes disengaging from the animus/animus possessor particularly challenging is that the relationship activates developmental patterns laid down in your earliest experiences with opposite-gender caretakers. Jung recognized that our first experiences of masculine and feminine energies, typically through our parents, create templates that profoundly influence our adult relationships. The animus/animus possessor intuitively connects with these early templates, creating relationship dynamics that feel simultaneously novel and deeply familiar. This paradoxical quality, the strange familiarity, creates powerful unconscious hooks that can keep you engaged long after conscious awareness recognizes the relationship as unhealthy. You may find yourself saying, "I know this isn't good for me, but I can't explain why I can't walk away." The path to protection from the animus/animus possessor requires developing what Jung would call psychological discernment, the ability to distinguish between authentic connection and archetypal projection. This discernment doesn't come easily. It requires dedicated inner work and often the painful recognition of how your own unintegrated anima or animus material makes you vulnerable to these dangerous personality types. Jung would emphasize that true protection comes not from avoiding relationships altogether, but from the ongoing work of conscious integration of your own masculine and feminine energies. As these aspects become more consciously held within your own psyche, you become less susceptible to their powerful projection from without. The magnetism of the animus/animus possessor diminishes as your own inner opposite-gender energy finds balance and expression through conscious integration rather than unconscious projection. The fourth dangerous personality type that emerges from Jungian psychology is the inflation enabler. This individual activates and encourages psychological inflation, a state Jung defined as an expansion of the personality beyond its legitimate boundaries through identification with an archetype or higher power. The inflation enabler is particularly dangerous because they initially appear as mentors, spiritual guides, or transformative presences offering access to expanded consciousness or special knowledge. They create contexts where normal psychological boundaries dissolve, presenting this dissolution not as dangerous, but as enlightenment. Unlike more obviously destructive personalities, the inflation enabler often genuinely believes in the inflated reality they're creating, making their influence all the more compelling and difficult to resist. The relationship with an inflation enabler typically begins during periods of legitimate psychological opening or spiritual seeking. Jung recognized that certain life transitions naturally create greater permeability between conscious and unconscious material, periods when we legitimately need new perspectives and guidance. The inflation enabler intuitively recognizes this openness and positions themselves as the perfect guide for your journey. What makes them so dangerous is how they blur the crucial distinction Jung maintained between the ego and the self, the archetype of wholeness and the regulating center of the psyche. They encourage you to identify directly with archetypal energies rather than relating to them, to believe you are special, chosen, or even divine rather than in relationship with these deeper aspects of the collective unconscious. The psychological damage inflicted by the inflation enabler develops gradually, often masked as spiritual or psychological advancement. Jung warned repeatedly about the dangers of inflation, observing how it disconnects individuals from the grounding forces of everyday reality and normal human relationships. Under the influence of an inflation enabler, you may begin to view ordinary concerns as beneath you, to disconnect from loved ones who don't understand your path, and to develop a grandiosity that actually impedes genuine psychological growth. The special language, practices, and worldview they introduce create what Jung might recognize as a kind of psychological cult, a closed system that reinterprets all experience to reinforce the inflated reality. Doubt itself becomes evidence of your need to go deeper into the very system causing the damage. What makes the inflation enabler's influence particularly enduring is how they activate the legitimate human longing for transcendence and meaning. Jung deeply understood this spiritual dimension of human psychology, devoting much of his work to exploring how we might authentically connect with the numinous without the dangers of inflation. The inflation enabler exploits this natural longing, offering shortcuts to transcendent experience that bypass the difficult integrative work that genuine psychological and spiritual development requires. The resulting experiences can indeed feel transformative and may include genuinely numinous elements, creating a powerful reinforcement cycle that deepens their influence over time. You find yourself chasing increasingly dramatic experiences of expanded consciousness, mistaking these temporary states for lasting transformation. The path to recovery from an inflation enabler's influence requires what Jung called psychological deflation, a painful but necessary return to the limitations and responsibilities of human existence. This process often involves grief as you relinquish the inflated self-image and special status the relationship conferred. Yet Jung would emphasize that this deflation, while initially experienced as loss, actually opens the door to more genuine spiritual and psychological development. True growth embraces both the heights of transcendent experience and the depths of mundane reality, integrating them rather than escaping into one at the expense of the other. Recognizing the inflation enabler before they distort your path requires developing what Jung might call spiritual discernment, the ability to distinguish between authentic numinous experience and inflated spiritual bypassing, between genuine guides who respect psychological boundaries and those who would dissolve them prematurely. The fifth dangerous personality type that Carl Gustav Jung's psychological framework helps us identify is the complex activator. This individual possesses an uncanny, though often unconscious, ability to precisely trigger your most painful psychological complexes, those emotionally charged clusters of associations built around core wounds and unmet needs from your developmental history. Jung pioneered the concept of complexes, describing them as splinter psyches that can temporarily hijack our conscious functioning when activated. The complex activator intuitively locates these tender spots in your psychological makeup and, whether intentionally or inadvertently, repeatedly stimulates them, creating relationships characterized by continuous emotional triggering and psychological regression. What makes the complex activator particularly dangerous is the cyclical nature of the relationship dynamic they create. The activation of your complexes creates intense emotional reactions that temporarily overwhelm your adult functioning, returning you to earlier developmental states where primitive psychological defenses predominate. From this regressed position, you respond in ways that then activate the complex activator's own unresolved material, creating an escalating cycle of mutual triggering. Jung might recognize this as a particularly destructive form of what he called participation mystique, a primitive psychological state where boundaries between individuals blur, allowing unconscious content to flow freely between them. While this state can facilitate profound connection when consciously navigated, in the hands of a complex activator, it becomes a channel for perpetual psychological wounding. The psychological damage from prolonged exposure to a complex activator stems from how they interfere with the natural healing process Jung observed in the psyche. Under normal circumstances, our complexes gradually lose their charge as we bring conscious awareness to them, understanding their origins and integrating their emotional content. The complex activator disrupts this healing trajectory by repeatedly reactivating wounds just as they begin to stabilize, creating a psychological condition similar to what modern trauma research calls complex trauma, a state where the nervous system never fully returns to baseline before experiencing the next activation. Over time, this can lead to complex enlargement rather than resolution, with your psychological wounds becoming increasingly sensitive and your responses more extreme. What makes disengagement from the complex activator so challenging is the powerful unconscious attraction these relationships often generate. Jung recognized that we are mysteriously drawn toward relationships that activate our unresolved complexes, not because we enjoy suffering, but because the psyche continually seeks opportunities to bring unconscious material into consciousness for healing. This creates a confusing situation where relationships that cause enormous pain can still feel inexplicably compelling or even necessary. The complex activator relationship hooks into this healing instinct but diverts it from its natural course, creating the illusion of psychological work while actually deepening the original wounds. You may find yourself thinking, "This relationship is painful, but it's teaching me so much about myself," without realizing that true learning requires periods of integration that this relationship continually disrupts. Protection from the complex activator requires developing what Jung would call complex consciousness, the ability to recognize when you're in the grip of a complex rather than responding from your centered adult self. This awareness creates a crucial space between trigger and response, allowing you to witness your activation without being completely identified with it. From this more objective position, you can begin to distinguish between relationships that activate your complexes in service of genuine growth and those that merely perpetuate patterns of wounding. Jung would emphasize that authentic healing relationships certainly involve complex activation, but they provide the crucial elements the complex activator relationship lacks: empathic attunement, appropriate boundaries, and enough psychological safety to integrate activated material before the next activation occurs. Learning to distinguish between these growth-oriented activations and merely repetitive ones becomes essential to protecting your psychological integrity. The sixth and perhaps most insidious dangerous personality type, illuminated by Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, is the shadow carrier. This individual unconsciously embodies and expresses the disowned collective shadow material of their social system, whether family, organization, community, or culture. Jung expanded his concept of the shadow beyond individual psychology to include collective dimensions, recognizing that groups also repress certain qualities and project them onto designated individuals or outsiders. The shadow carrier becomes the vessel for these projections, expressing the forbidden impulses and carrying the moral darkness that others in the system cannot acknowledge in themselves. What makes them particularly dangerous is how they simultaneously attract and repel us. We are drawn to them precisely because they express shadow elements we've had to suppress, yet we condemn them for the very qualities that fascinate us. The relationship with a shadow carrier creates a complex psychological dynamic that Jung might recognize as a form of scapegoating with archetypal dimensions. The shadow carrier doesn't simply behave badly. They perform an unconscious psychological function for the collective. By embodying the shadow, they allow others to maintain an illusion of moral purity through contrast and comparison. "At least I'm not like them" becomes the unconscious refrain that permits continued shadow denial within the group. This psychological arrangement creates a powerful unconscious investment in the shadow carrier's continued dysfunction. The system actually requires them to remain problematic, even while ostensibly trying to help or change them. This contradiction creates the perfect conditions for enabling relationships that appear supportive on the surface, while unconsciously reinforcing destructive patterns. What makes the shadow carrier particularly difficult to identify is the collective nature of the dynamic. Unlike other dangerous personality types whose problematic nature might be recognized through individual discernment, the shadow carrier's role is continuously reinforced through group processes. Jung understood that collective psychology operates by different principles than individual psychology. When enough people share a projection, it gains a kind of consensus reality that becomes extraordinarily difficult to penetrate with individual insight. You may find yourself alone in questioning the group's narrative about the shadow carrier, doubting your own perceptions when they contradict the collective view. This social reinforcement creates a powerful incentive to participate in the projection rather than challenging it, making the shadow carrier dynamic particularly resistant to intervention. The psychological danger of involvement with a shadow carrier operates at multiple levels simultaneously. At the individual level, these relationships often activate your own disowned shadow material through a process Jung called contagion, the unconscious transmission of psychological states from one person to another. This activation can lead you to behave in ways that violate your conscious values, only to project responsibility for these behaviors onto the shadow carrier afterward. At the systemic level, participation in the scapegoating dynamic compromises your moral integrity, as you become complicit in a process that causes genuine harm while disguising itself as righteousness. Jung recognized this pattern as particularly damaging to the soul, creating what he might call a state of unconscious moral injury that disconnects you from your authentic ethical compass. Protection from the shadow carrier dynamic requires developing what Jung would call shadow consciousness, the ongoing commitment to recognizing and integrating your own shadow material rather than projecting it outward. This doesn't mean abandoning moral discernment or excusing genuinely destructive behavior. Rather, it means approaching such behavior with the awareness that your reaction contains important information about your own psychology. Jung would suggest that genuine moral clarity emerges not from projection but from integration, the humble recognition of how the qualities you condemn most harshly in others exist in some form within yourself. This integration doesn't weaken moral boundaries but actually strengthens them, as judgments no longer serve unconscious needs for shadow management but arise from conscious ethical discernment. By withdrawing your projections from the shadow carrier, you not only protect yourself from the psychological dangers of the relationship, but potentially disrupt the collective dynamic that maintains their destructive role. As we draw this exploration to a close, we're left with a profound understanding of how Carl Gustav Jung's psychological insights can illuminate the dangerous personality types that threaten our psychological well-being. These 6 types, the persona manipulator, the shadow projector, the animus/animus possessor, the inflation enabler, the complex activator, and the shadow carrier, represent distinct patterns of unconscious dynamics that can entangle us in destructive relationships despite our best conscious intentions. What unites them is how they all operate primarily through unconscious mechanisms, activating aspects of our own psyches in ways that bypass rational discernment. This explains why conventional wisdom about red flags often fails us. These dangerous types don't announce themselves through obvious warning signs, but through subtle psychological resonances that require a deeper level of awareness to detect. The protection Jung's framework offers us isn't about developing suspicion or isolation, but about cultivating psychological consciousness, the capacity to recognize unconscious processes as they unfold, both within ourselves and in our relationships. This consciousness doesn't develop overnight. It emerges gradually through committed inner work, through facing our own shadow material, integrating our anima or animus energies, becoming aware of our complexes, and withdrawing our projections from others. This is the individuation process that Jung considered the central task of human life, the journey toward psychological wholeness that necessarily includes confronting the darker aspects of human nature rather than denying or projecting them. By engaging in this process, we develop not just protection from dangerous personality types, but a more authentic way of being in the world. Perhaps the most valuable insight from this Jungian exploration is understanding that our vulnerability to dangerous personalities isn't random but patterned. These individuals affect us precisely because they connect with unresolved aspects of our own psychological makeup. There's profound empowerment in this realization, as it shifts us from seeing ourselves as helpless victims of others' manipulations to active participants in our psychological fate. Jung would emphasize that this shift in perspective doesn't blame the victim, but offers a path toward genuine agency. By understanding how these dangerous types hook into our own unintegrated material, our shadow aspects, our complexes, our anima or animus projections, we gain the capacity to consciously address these vulnerabilities rather than unconsciously repeating destructive patterns with different people who activate the same dynamics. As we conclude this journey through the dangerous personality types Carl Gustav Jung would warn us about, it's important to remember that his ultimate vision wasn't one of fear but of wholeness. Jung believed deeply in the human capacity for psychological transformation, not by avoiding darkness but by integrating it consciously. The dangerous personalities we've explored represent different ways of relating to the shadow unconsciously, whether through denial, projection, inflation, or identification. The alternative isn't perfection but consciousness, the willingness to acknowledge the full spectrum of human nature within ourselves while maintaining ethical boundaries in our relationships with others. This integration doesn't make us immune to psychological danger, but it does provide us with an inner compass that can guide us toward healthier connections and away from those that would fragment our psyche. In the end, Jung's greatest gift to us may be the recognition that the very qualities that make us vulnerable to dangerous personalities, our complexity, our depth, our capacity for projection and unconscious resonance, are also the qualities that make us fully human. The solution isn't to diminish these aspects of ourselves, but to bring them into greater consciousness, transforming unconscious vulnerabilities into conscious strengths. By developing awareness of the 6 dangerous personality types we've explored, we aren't just protecting ourselves from external threats. We're engaging in the profound work of psychological maturation that Jung saw as humanity's greatest challenge and opportunity. Perhaps there's no more fitting conclusion than Jung's own words. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. May this exploration help you transform unconscious patterns into conscious choices, creating relationships that foster wholeness rather than fragmentation. If this exploration of dangerous personality types through the lens of Jungian psychology has resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps these valuable psychological insights reach others who might benefit from them. Share your own experiences or insights in the comments below. Your perspective may illuminate aspects of these dynamics that others need to hear. Remember that the journey towards psychological wholeness isn't one we make alone, but in community with fellow travelers. By subscribing, you'll join a community dedicated to exploring the depths of human psychology with both compassion and courage. Thank you for being part of this journey toward greater psychological consciousness.